The events in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec and Ottawa this week put the eyes of the world on our country. The agenda examined those events and the fallout from the tragedies earlier this week, and we bring you highlights from those conversations right now in a special Week in Review. Here's the timeline of what went down just before 10 o'clock this morning, Eastern Time, in our nation's capital. A gunman, later identified as Michel Zehaf Bibeau, in his 30s, opened fire at the National War Memorial. One soldier was killed. Bibeau was then thought to have carjacked a car, stormed Parliament Hill, started firing inside, through the Peace Tower and in the center block on Parliament Hill. He was shot and killed by the Sergeant-at-Arms Kevin Vickers, who is being described as the hero of the day. Parliament Hill has since been placed under lockdown. Yes, there are still members of Parliament, including the opposition leader and the leader of the third party, who are under lockdown on Parliament Hill. Everybody reported safe, though. All the caucuses meet on Wednesdays on Parliament Hill. No injuries to any of our members of Parliament or any of their staff, etc. There were a few other injuries. A security guard was shot in the leg, but he's apparently going to be okay. And the soldier, of course, identified as Corporal Nathan Cirillo, 24 years old, a 6-year-old son from Hamilton, Ontario, a member of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. If you visit his Facebook page, you will see pictures of a man who was so full of life, and that life is now over tonight. Okay, let's introduce our guests on the program, and there he is. Let's introduce our guests on our program tonight. Stockwell Day is with us. He's in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's a former federal cabinet minister, now strategic advisor at Macmillan LLP. In the nation's capital via Skype, Christian Leuprecht. He's a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada. And with us here in studio, Besma Momani, senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Jonathan Kay, comment page editor and columnist at the National Post. Jonathan, what are we calling this?
Well, the Prime Minister calls it terrorism. But that goes to the frame of mind of the gunman who did this. If he had in mind a political act, then it was indeed terrorism. He's now dead. And so we're going to have to try and find out, based on his past, based on the reasons that he was having his travel restricted by the federal government. Presumably the security agencies know a lot more than we do, because there was a reason that his travel from Canada was restricted. He's a recent convert to Islam, perhaps a fan of ISIS, but that information may tell us why he committed this act, and it may justify the Prime Minister's use of the word terrorism.
Stockwell Day, you're a former public security minister in this government. What are you calling what happened today?
It's absolutely a act from everything we know and we've heard. This individual, who himself had renamed himself Abdul and had claimed to have converted to radical Islamist ideology. He didn't rob a bank. He didn't rob a drugstore. He killed a soldier and he attacked the Parliament buildings. This is a terrorist act.
Besma Momani, your view.
Well, I mean, the symbolism here, obviously, going into Parliament and the War Memorial lends itself to calling it a terrorist attack, but he's a criminal, and he's a well-known criminal to security forces, to the police. He has a rap sheet, and I think what we need to know is what was his motivation. I think without a connection to some sort of organized grouping, at a well-known terrorist organization, then we have a lone wolf criminal who did a terrible thing to terrorize people. But is he a terrorist? I think that really depends on, as Jonathan said, what are his connections and motivations?
Does the fact that apparently ISIS had a picture of him that they tweeted out today change your opinion about him at all?
Well, I mean, I think the opinion of him, obviously, right now across the country is that this is a terrible person committing a terrible crime.
Affect what his motive may be. Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that, you know, one thing, let's not forget, ISIS is internet savvy. It has a social media empire. Perhaps more in terms of its strength, in terms of arms and so forth, is its social media presence. So I don't know what the connections are. And I don't think that having sympathy with ISIS, as awful as that is, and there will be people who will be attracted to that type of violence, as awful as it may be, that does not make them necessarily connected to ISIS if they have sympathy with this terrible organization to claim that they are representative of ISIS. So we have to find a link, a causal link between ISIS or a directive from ISIS to this individual to really claim that it is certifiably a terrorist act. That doesn't take away from the reality that it's an awful act.
I know we don't want to rush to judgment, it's pretty hard not to rush to judgment tonight, isn't it?
The evidence obviously points to terrorism. The only reason that I offer a caveat is there are sometimes random lunatics who do attack political figures, and it's not attached to any particular ideology. The guy who tried to shoot Ronald Reagan, or who did shoot Ronald Reagan and almost killed him, the guy who allegedly tried to kill Pauline Marois a couple of years ago. Sometimes people attack symbols of national power, they attack national leaders, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with politics or religion. They're simply evil lunatics. It happens. In this case, as you say, the evidence does point to something more organized and more terroristic than that. But the media has been burned in the past. I remember with Anders Breivik, when those terrible attacks happened in Norway, newspapers went to press the next day falsely attributing those attacks to militant Islam. It turned out that wasn't the case. So in the past, precedent has shown that we have to be quite careful before we label it terrorism, although I completely agree that in this case, the evidence does suggest that this was a terrorist attack motivated by militant Islam.
We went out to the streets today to find out what Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario had to say about all of this, and let's play that clip now. Roll tape, please.
You know, as an American, the first thing I think about, you know, or the concept that we have of Canadians in America is that Canadians are more friendly people. So to think that it was an attack on Parliament, I'm assuming by Canadians, is very disheartening.
First impressions, I'm not surprised given the fact of 9/11. I think all Canadians need to be cognizant of this can happen, and that we're not, given the fact we live close to the United States, this is definitely a possibility, and I think that a lot of Canadians are naive about the whole thing.
I don't know if we've been naive, but I know that we haven't thought much about it because we've never really had any problems. But like I said, I think we all have to be on the cautious now, and we all have to be aware of who's around us at all times.
This is a very sad, unfortunate, horrific wake-up call to us as a nation that we must now be even more vigilant about gun activity, terrorism, without being racists.
An intense loss of innocence on the part of the whole nation. We won't be the same country, I think, tomorrow that we were this morning before it unfolded.
You know, I don't think this would change our values. We have a belief in letting everybody into our society, and our society is a pretty safe society.
I hope this Remembrance Day, people take it a little more seriously, because obviously, I mean, just based on what happened in Saint Jean the other day, and now the fact that it was a soldier first shot today, I think that they're targeting our soldiers.
Well, my first impression, of course, was shock. And then I guess I started to think the world is a different place now, and even Canada isn't immune, even though we like to think so.
I want to pick up on one of the comments that I heard Stockwell Day in the midst of all of that, and that is, again, not pushing the comparisons with 9/11 too much, but there's no question that America is a different country today than it was on September the 10th, 2001. It's indisputable. And my question is Canada now a different place today than it was yesterday, and will it be going forward? What's your view?
I believe we're different, and we will be going forward. Our hearts remain the same. But, you know, I characterize it this way. I do some work for a company that offers cyber security services to companies to prevent cyber attacks. And also assessments in malls and public places. I can tell you that up until now, anyway, the degree of naivety that's out there, even among professionals in business, or providing things like security facilities, the level of naivety was somewhat surprising to me. I'm guessing, Steve, that level has dropped and that we now have a very heightened awareness of the dangers that are out there. That will be more acute in our own psyche. I don't think it's going to change us as Canadians. The majority are being people who love others and are accepting of others, but we're going to be more careful.
Going forward, Christian Leuprecht, are we no longer going to be the same country?
Well, I think I mean there are echoes here of the October crisis and the way the government responded then, and it suggests, I think, that geostrategically we've perhaps as a country and society been somewhat isolated from the instabilities elsewhere in the world, and it shows that in the 21st century, perhaps as a result of both the communications and transportation revolutions that we've undergone over the last century, we are now no longer immune, and we need to be cognizant that the instabilities elsewhere in the world can have repercussions, very concrete repercussions for our society back here. And so what we do on the one hand to keep our own society safe, and on the other hand ensuring the stability of other societies is imperative to ensuring the public safety of all Canadians and Canadian interests.
Just wanted to confirm, when you talk about the October crisis, you mean October, Quebec, 1970, FLQ, that's what you're referring to?
Right, and I guess what I also refer to is that these incidents luckily have been fairly isolated in Canadian history, and so that we also need to I think recognize that as a society we've been fairly resilient. We have had, it seems, a fairly deterrent, effective legislative framework in place, and that by and large until now our security and criminal intelligence services have done an effective job at foiling these types of plots, and so we can only hope that this will be an outlier, but that, as the RCMP in its press conference today pointed out, will require Canadians to be more vigilant about those in our society who may want to do us harm. And it means that we now need to start to live like many other democratic societies in the world, with perhaps a certain amount of individuals in our very midst who want to do our way of life and us harm.
Okay. Jonathan Kay, your view on whether we're in a different country going forward?
I really think we should have to put this in perspective a little bit. What happened in Ottawa was horrible, but ultimately it was one bad guy killing one good guy and then dying. It's extremely dramatic circumstances, extremely symbolic circumstances, but we're not at war. These things go in cycles. 100 years ago it was the anarchists. In the middle of the Cold War there was a wave of communist-inspired groups. There was a period when planes were getting hijacked to Cuba every month. You know, there were murderous cults. Japan had a huge murderous cult problem. These things go up and down. And when 9/11 came, I remember there were people saying we're at war, this is the new normal, and that we were going to have terrorist attacks every month. And that,
well, if not terrorist, I mean, to be sure, there have not been terrorist attacks every month, but there's a new normal in the United States.
There's definitely a new normal when you go to an airport. Mm-hmm. And there definitely is a new normal if you're a Muslim or Arab suspect and you get taken in by the FBI.
Yeah.
But for the average citizen on the street, I don't think there is as much a new normal as they predicted 13 years ago when people were saying that there was going to be apocalyptic terrorist attacks every month. That hasn't happened. It's happened in part because of increased security awareness. But I would like to see the media and ordinary citizens not proclaim World War III every time some Islamist-inspired lunatic walks into a building and shoots somebody. I think it degrades the concept of what war is. I think if we ask our grandparents what things were like in World War II, when tens of thousands of people were dying every month, and that went on for years and years and years, and entire countries lay in ruins, which, by the way, is happening in the Middle East, but is not happening in Canada. I think maybe we can scale back a little bit about the rhetoric about everything has changed and, you know, we live in a different world as if it's some sci-fi movie and we're going to wake up to, you know, this apocalyptic landscape. This is one horribly deranged guy, probably inspired by radical Islam. I don't think we should allow him to redefine our society, and I certainly don't think we should allow him to turn the major tourist destinations in Ottawa into some kind of theme park where everything is behind cages and walls.
I hear you. This is one of those countries, though, where we always think this really ought not to happen here. America, of course, a violent society, tens of thousands of handgun murders a year. Not Canada, surely not Canada.
Yeah, that's because
right?
we're utopian narcissists, and you know, this is how we react to every terrible thing. This is how we react when people kill each other at Jane and Finch here in Toronto. You know, there is this spasm of moral vanity that takes place in Canada every time something horrible happens. And I agree that we have to wake up to the fact that that's silly, but I don't think we should see it as some kind of epic transition in our civilization. It's not that. And if we think that way, we have the danger of overreacting.
Besma, your view on whether we're in a new world now in Canada?
Well, you know, I think what I'll wake up to is knowing what Canada and our comparative advantages in this country. institutions that work, a judicial process that I think is fair, that actually, I think, has a great tradition of jurists. Let the legal system work, let the investigation work, let our good forces in the police and security sector really investigate this properly. And at the end of the day, one of our last comparative advantages, I think, is our diverse society. And I hope that never changes. I hope that there are no awful looks given to people who we think are part of a war on them. We need to be very careful. And I think that's the Canada that I was born and raised in. I hope that's the Canada that stays. John?
One thing I'd just like to say about the video, video from Parliament was shocking, where you heard the shots. I was actually inspired by that when you saw all these guys running in the direction of danger. This is what they were trained to do. I mean, there was one hero who we've named who apparently shot the murderer, but you had dozens of guys who were running to the gunshots. I mean, this is what they were trained to do. That's, to me, the inspiring thing we should take away from this. Personally, I would run fleeing in terror. But
you're not a first responder.
I'm not a first responder.
They are.
Yeah, I'm not even a second responder. But I was actually, when I was watching it, as horrified as I was also saying, wow, this is you hear about these security forces in Afghanistan and Iraq who run away sometimes the first sign of danger. Here you have these people who are obviously well-trained patriots who are doing what we'd want them to do.
Today there were speeches in the House of Commons this morning that were all, frankly, excellent. What was unprecedented? The Prime Minister, after finishing his speech, went over, he shook the hands of Kevin Vickers to thank him for what he did. He then went over and hugged Justin Trudeau. He initiated the hug. He then went to Tom Mulcair and hugged Tom Mulcair. And when they spoke, they did the same. Knowing what you know about how much these men despise each other, what do you think all of that says?
They rose to the occasion.
Yeah.
I think this is, things happen. And this was a profoundly emotional event for the House of Commons family. And it's corny, but it is a family. It's a group of people who, somebody's on the other side is sick and you hear about their wife not being well, or their kid's got some problem. Everybody talks about it quietly. You bring people over and you talk. The Prime Minister, I think, the last couple of days has shown a lot of, more than just class. I think he's shown a side of himself that I don't think most Canadians have ever seen before. I think today in the House he was informal, he was relaxed, he was just saying, look, we're here, we're going back to work, going to business. I think the other two leaders spoke with great passion and care about what went on. And I do think that it's important for Canadians to know that despite all of the bickering and all of the fighting that you see on television and in question period, there are moments when, in fact, people can transcend that, and it doesn't happen very often. And maybe it should happen more often. But I can certainly recall my parliamentary experience 2 or 3 times when things like that happened, when it was clearly a moment when people just said, "But this is an extraordinary moment. The House was under attack."
Yeah.
And it's all very well for us now to look back and say, "Well, this is what happened." But if you're sitting in the caucus room of the Conservatives or the New Democrats, and you're sitting on either side of that hallway, and you're hearing that gunfire,
with chairs barring the door,
you don't know whether how many guys are out there. You don't know whether there's 50 guys attacking the House with guns and rifles. You have no clue what's going on. You're just hearing this bang, 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 bang.
Speaking to MPs, Bob's got it exactly right. The two parties, one on the other side of the hall, both barricaded with chairs against their caucus doors, share terror.
Yeah.
That's what they went through because they didn't know what was happening.
We're going to get Jordan Peterson out here in a second to talk more about fear and the influence it has. But I've got to go to Josh on Parliament Hill and just get give us some of the feedback you're getting today from those extraordinary, never mind the speeches. I thought the most impressive gesture this morning was the hug. No speeches, just a hug. What are you hearing?
Well, one thing that struck me about the Prime Minister's speech in general was his very sort of high-profile sort of mention about mental health. And I think, this comes at a time when we've been having that conversation about post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health, particularly in the military. I think Canada's come a long way in the last decade or so in talking about mental health. And there you had the Prime Minister a day after this attack. As Bob mentions, you had maybe, 300 MPs and senators in those 2 rooms combined on either side of that hallway. And there's the Prime Minister of Canada urging those people to talk to a doctor, seek treatment, and take care of themselves if they're feeling well. These are people who are not hit, but could be hurt, And that to me struck me as a profound moment. I think a real sign of the times. Other than that, it was very collegial today in Parliament. I certainly had a lot of people come up to me, talk. I think connection with other people who I know witnessed it. Going up to them and seeing that they're okay. You can tell that people are dealing with it in different ways. Some of them look like they have sort of longer fuses, and some of them look like they have shorter fuses on this sort of thing. I think it'll take a lot of time, and I think certainly more than the MPs would, take the Prime Minister's words to heart on that. I know I did.
Well, if you haven't seen this footage yet today, stick around because this was dramatic this morning. Many people are calling Sergeant-at-Arms Kevin Vickers, as we have here at this table, the hero after he shot and killed the gunman on Parliament Hill yesterday. And here's how he was received in the House of Commons today as Parliament resumed. Watch. You know, it's interesting, with all the speeches on Parliament Hill this morning, and he didn't say a thing. He did not speak, as was appropriate. His job is to stand on guard for them, and he did. And they were applauding. Jordan Peterson, welcome to our table, professor of psychology at University of Toronto. They were applauding because he probably saved their lives yesterday. There he is, back at work, one day after shooting somebody dead in Parliament.
Yep.
If he's a normal person, what's going on in his head right now?
It's his duty. The best predictor of success in military institutions is dutifulness, conscientiousness, and people like that, they go back to work. It's the right thing to do. And everybody in Ottawa went back to work today. It's like, hooray for that.
Yeah, everybody in Ottawa went back to work today, but only one person shot and killed somebody, and it was him.
Yeah.
How does he just go back to work and carry the mace and just do the same thing all over again?
Well, people can be unbelievably tough, and he's obviously one of them. So good for him. He's obviously good at what he does too, so I guess we're pretty happy he's back.
He had a long period. He's in charge of a very large security detail in the House. He's the chief security officer. He's not just the mace carrier, and he has a long record of military service and security service. He's a highly trained man. Very experienced.
Talk to us. We saw off the top of the program Josh's footage of what's amazing about that footage are the numbers of people, first responders, who are running towards the danger.
Yep.
Blows you away every time you think about that. Talk to us about fear and the reaction that, Mr. and Mrs. Everyday Ontario have to that versus these people who run towards the danger.
Well, I've been spectacularly impressed today, I think, with the way that people in Ottawa and people in Canada in general are reacting to this. There is no real evidence that we should be more afraid than we were yesterday. There was comments earlier on the show that these guys aren't like the Columbine killers, but they're a lot like the Columbine killers. And to think of them as agents of, say, Islamic terrorism, which is kind of the undercurrent of the discussion so far, I think plays into the hands of the people who are trying to recruit guys like this. They're primarily resentful and angry, and if their lives aren't going well, they have a reason for it. And the reason is the system is corrupt and needs to be brought down. And then they have an opportunity to engage themselves in some fictional romantic activity and turn to violence. And there's no protection against that, but to think of it as as Islamic terrorism, it's not a good idea. So
you brought a list with you.
You know, I couldn't disagree more, and maybe that's a discussion worth having. We've always had angry young men in history whose lives are not going well. So the really relevant question is, what do you do about it? We have a systematic pattern now of conversion to a radical fringe of Islam, which has been ruthlessly condemned by leaders of the Islamic community who are deeply worried about this. But when you see this pattern happening again and again and again, I agree with Bob. There is something here that we have to take a hard look at. Yes.
I think I'm sort of somewhere, I mean, listening to Jordan, I'm somewhere in between what he's saying and what Janet's saying. I mean, I think we do have to look at what is the version of the romance, if you like to use your language. What is this romance? And we kind of have to understand how that romance gets taken hold of by these. And there are a variety of ways. If you're a young Somali or and you're captured by this, you're going back to your homeland and you're engaging in a struggle. That's clearly a political thing which attaches to somebody who's maybe marginalized in Canada and not engaging in what's going on, doesn't have a job and isn't getting any work and all that.
But this is not that.
This is not that.
No.
And so in that sense, I think Jordan is right to say, this is not like some organized terrorist attack. That's not what this is. But we do have to understand a little bit more about, well, how is it that this particular version of this marginal Islam that people talk about, how is it that this is taking hold with these guys?
You've got a checklist there, right? You got a checklist of characteristics?
Yeah.
You want to share some of that with us?
Well, they're often recent converts in England and the UK and Europe.
And the two here in Canada.
Yeah. They're usually young, middle class, at least reasonably well off, often from intact families. They're often educated. They're not puritanical. They're usually religious novices. So these aren't people who've been meditating in silence for 20 years trying to get their head together around some divine idea. And the mere fact that they found a cover story like I'm an Islamic fundamentalist doesn't mean that their primary motives are religious. And why do we think they know their primary motives? I mean, from the primary motives of people who spontaneously erupt in murderousness like this are revenge and resentment. Yeah. And then they have a cover story so they can stand looking at themselves in the mirror. And the cover stories vary from time to time. It's not like I don't think that the ISIS attempts to
exploit.
Yes, are irrelevant.
And recruit.
Yeah. They're not irrelevant.
There is a recruitment going on.
Well, there's encouragement.
But it's going on Facebook. It's going on on Facebook. It's going on social media. And for all we know, frankly, we don't know exactly how did these guys get recruited into this particular
just to
version of belief.
To follow on what Jordan says, first of all, these two young ones don't fit this pattern. They were not middle class. They were at the margin.
Well, yesterday's guy.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the mother was, but the father had gone to Libya, right? So there was an affinity there. But so if we take young angry men, they could join the mafia, and they could be heroes, and in their own eyes, right? But they're not. They are consistently doing the same thing now, and it's not only happening in this country, it's true in Britain, it's true in Australia. So we have to look at the pattern. I know it's not easy to do, but we're fooling ourselves if we don't say there's a pattern.
Before the clock gets away from here, I do want to talk about the impact fear may or may not have in this circumstance. And Josh, let me go to you first on this. Everybody's putting up a pretty brave face today. I know the leaders are saying we're not going to be intimidated by these kinds of things, but it would be expected that everybody, having been through what they've been through yesterday, would be afraid. And I wonder whether Parliament is feeling enough of that right now to do something legislatively that they might not ordinarily do were they not this afraid. What do you think?
I think we're about to see. We'd reported earlier this week that the bill, Stephen Blaney's bill about new sort of counterterrorism powers, was due to be tabled this week. I do not think it will be, and certainly signs are it won't be. So if that changes dramatically in the next little while, I think we'll see the impact of these events. I mean, I had one MP tell me yesterday that if this is the new normal, then they're going back to the private sector. They're not going to do this. So I think there might be a chill effect. Now, that could be the immediate sort of adrenaline or grief speaking there. But, you know, if this is something, I think we'd be fooling ourselves to say that all MPs were totally comfortable going back into the House of Commons today. We're totally comfortable going back to offices where their doors were broken down during the search of the building. I mean, you know, there are a lot of brave faces going on. I think the proof will be in the pudding when we see, you know, how this shakes down. If we have more worries and lockdowns like this, I think we'd be crazy to think that some people wouldn't throw up their hands and walk away.
Jordan, follow up on that. What are the dangers of making policy in a climate of fear?
Well, the danger is that you make policies that do more damage than good. You know, I mean, these are rare events still, even though we had 2 happen in the same week. They don't seem to be associated in any direct way. I mean, if you're reacting in the immediate aftermath of an unexpected and rare event, you're going to be more predisposed to put into place policies that aren't going to be productive in the long run.
I mean, we've been through this in 9/11. Sorry, Jordan.
Yep, no problem.
If you look at 9/11, you know, there was a hasty reaction in every country, and
none more than in the U.S.
None more than the U.S., but also in Canada. And so you then say, you know, and since that time, everybody's looking at saying, well, do we need to go that far? You know, is that really what we needed to do, or do we need to do that now? And that's the kind of discussion that we need to have. I don't think it's a bad thing that we're making, you know, considering what's really happened and saying, okay, this can happen. Because a lot of the time in Canada, the argument is, well, we're different, you know. We're not. And it took us 25 years to absorb the fact that over 330, largely Canadians, were blown up in the air by radical terrorists who were homegrown.
You're talking Air India.
Yeah, Air India. It was the biggest civilian terrorist attack of its time, and right up to 9/11 would have been. And so you sort of say, if it took Canadians 25 years to say, actually, this happened in Canada, and so, you know, it's time we dealt with it.
Jordan.
Well, the other danger is that the emotion surrounding an event like this can be hijacked by people who have an a priori political agenda. And that did happen in the U.S. after 9/11, and it was not good. And so you saw what happened in the U.S. was that the fear that was generated by the attacks provided the motive force for the Bush administration to put together plans that they had long before there was a World Tower bombing.
But then they had the pretext for it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that, you know, high emotion can give you the pretext for pushing through things that, you know, you've developed on your own for reasons that are completely unrelated to the actual event. And that's not a good thing. You know, and the thing that we will allow the terrorists, such as they are, to win to the degree that we restrict our civil liberties in the aftermath of this, because that's what they want. And they should not be allowed their victory. We go back to normal.
Sorry, Jordan. Josh, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, public outcry is an example, sort of beat back the Vic Taves, You're With Us, or the child pornographers bill, and that got yanked and sort of reintroduced in different forms, more pulled back. You know, that's the type of bill you got to think might have got through if we'd been in this environment, right? It's not just that MPs become more brazen. I think it's the public outcry might be dampened on something like that. And as we sit here waiting for the Blaney bill, I think that should be kept front of mind.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.